Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today we are going to find out how often the sequel is better than the original, at least when it comes to sci-fi books. As I have created a list of sci-fi series where I'm going to compare book 1 versus book 2 and tally up the score in order to see which one wins. Am I team original or team sequel? Let's find out. Starting with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Up first we have The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy versus The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. So I liked The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I thought it was very funny, it was definitely very British, and it had some pretty cool sci-fi ideas. The only thing that prevented it from becoming an all-time favorite for me is that the story I felt left a little bit to be desired. I wanted just a slightly more elaborate or rewarding plot, but overall a really great book. Classic, obviously. Then when it comes to The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, I enjoyed this one too, but I didn't find it to be quite as funny as book 1, and the fact that not a lot happens plot-wise, the amount that bothered me, I guess, starts to add up over time. The longer a book goes, the longer a series goes, without it sort of hitting some satisfying beats, the more that becomes an issue, affects my reading experience. So, while I did like The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, I'm going to have to go with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which means the team original is up 1-0. Up next, we have Foundation by Isaac Asimov, with Foundation versus Foundation and Empire. Foundation is one of the most influential books in science fiction, and I think deservedly so. Each of the parts of this book tackles an idea in an interesting way and also helps to develop the world. I think those are Asimov's strengths, and I know that the writing can be a little bit dry, character development is not the focus, but as someone that enjoys classic sci-fi, hard sci-fi, this didn't overly negatively enjoy my reading experience. I'm a fan. When it came to Foundation and Empire, to me, I felt like things were a little bit stretched out. I found the ideas to be slightly less impactful. However, it does include my favorite character in the series, so there were some pluses to it, but overall, that wasn't enough to overcome what I thought were stronger elements in Foundation, so I'm going to have to go with another book 1, Foundation. Team Original now up 2-0. Moving on, we have the Culture series by Ian M. Banks with Consider Fleabag versus The Player of Games. So I think I'm a little bit higher on Consider Fleabag than a lot of Culture readers, as I know it is a somewhat more down-the-line space opera, not quite as original or creative as some other Culture books, but I thought it was executed really well. And I know a lot of people don't jive with the main character, but I found them to be quite interesting, trying to decide whether I thought they were a good character, a bad character, whether I was rooting for them or not, but either way, I found their actions to be believable, so I had a good time reading this one, but when it comes to The Player of Games, I think it is a more ambitious and more rewarding read. I was more impacted by the themes, and I think it has some more memorable scenes. It's not one of my all-time favorite books, but of the 4 Culture books I've read so far, The Player of Games has been my favorite, so putting a point up on the board for Team Sequel, the score is now 2-1. Up next, we have Red Rising by Pierce Brown, with Red Rising versus Golden Sun. Book 1, Red Rising, is a bit of a polarizing one. I know that some people think it reads like YA, or that it borrows too much from the Hunger Games, and I do see some similarities, obviously, but for me, this was still a fairly adult novel. I think there were some rather intense scenes in the book, and I think for the most part, it was executed pretty well. I had a good time while reading it. I think I just wanted a little bit more to happen. I want it to be a little bit more ambitious. And that is what we get with Golden Sun. I have read the original 3 books in the Red Rising trilogy, and Golden Sun is my favorite. This expands the world into a bigger, grander space opera. The character relationships are great, the twists, the betrayals, the action scenes. I think this is sort of really what Red Rising was trying to be as a series. I think Pierce Brown nailed it with Golden Sun. So I will be continuing with the sequel books when the final book, Book 7, is announced, but for now, Golden Sun is my favorite so far, and it puts up another score for Team Sequel, tying the score at 2-2. Alright, up next we have Ender's Saga by Orson Scott Card, with Ender's Game versus Speaker for the Dead. So this is an interesting one because of the series we've had so far, I think this pairing has the 2 books that are the most different. With Ender's Game, I think you have something that is quite readable, it's quite fast-paced, and I really enjoyed the characters, the action, the tactical battles, the training at Battle School. I found to be really interesting and entertaining. And even though it focuses on younger characters, I thought the themes and the philosophy were very rewarding. I thought there's a lot of depth to this book, even though it's a fun, fast read as well, and of course, it has an all-time great ending. Whereas Speaker for the Dead is so much slower, it's even more philosophical, it really dives into some big ideas, the plot moves slowly, and this isn't what I expected or necessarily wanted after Ender's Game, but by the time I got to the end of it, it had won me over. I think it's a really rich, rewarding experience, even though I wasn't quite as entertained on a page-by-page basis. So I can see why different people will like one or the other. Different readers will be pulled in different directions because they're so different. For me, though, I have to go with Ender's Game because I think it nailed pretty much every component. It's an all-time favorite sci-fi book for me. So that puts Team Original back up 3-2. Up next, we have The Expanse by James S.A. Corey with Leviathan Wakes versus Caliban's War. Leviathan Wakes introduces us to a near-future space opera, and it tells the story from two POVs. Both of the stories are quite different, and they weave together in a really satisfying way. I think there's some great ideas, some great action, just pretty much everything I want in a fun, fast popcorn read. And I don't say that in a derogatory way because I think there is some depth there too, but it's just something that I can get through quickly and when I'm in the mood for some enjoyable sci-fi. Caliban's War has a similar style, but for me it didn't hit quite as hard. I thought some of the character development, the arcs, didn't really resonate with me, and I thought the action scenes, I didn't quite feel the tension, the excitement that I did with Leviathan Wakes, and there were more POVs and not all of them hit for me, whereas I liked just the two that were in Leviathan Wakes. I thought they both worked. I will say, however, though, in Caliban's War, it introduces two of my favorite characters in the series, so I still liked it, and I think it pays off down the line, but if I'm just comparing book 1 to book 2, for me, I've got to go with Leviathan Wakes. Stretching the lead for Team Original out to 4-2. Alright, up next we have The Dark Tower by Stephen King with The Gunslinger versus The Drawing of the Three. So this is another pairing where book 1 feels pretty different to book 2. With The Gunslinger, despite it being the shortest book in The Dark Tower, I'm currently up to book 6, Song for Susanna. Despite it being quite short, I found it less readable. It was slower paced, it's a little confusing at times, and I didn't quite enjoy it that much on a page-by-page basis, although I was intrigued to see where it was going to go, and I'm glad I continued because I did quite like the ending, and that launched my journey into The Dark Tower. With The Drawing of the Three, I started to get some of those aspects that Stephen King is most well known for. I think the characters are phenomenal. Some of the characters that get introduced in this book have just such great personalities, and the dialogue here is wonderful. Each of the characters are so distinct from each other, and they can make you laugh, they can make you angry, and Stephen King does such a good job of creating an atmosphere, a feel for time and place, which is definitely a skill in a series where you gotta bounce around a lot in terms of time and place. I also thought that the plot was far more rewarding, the pacing was better, and this was the book that made me a fan of the Dark Tower series and made me pretty sure that I wanted to push on through and get to the end, which hopefully I do in the next month or so. So, of these two, it was clearly The Drawing of the Three for me, bringing the score back to 4-3. Moving on, we have The Remembrance of Earth's Past by Cixin Liu, with The Three-Body Problem versus The Dark Forest. I enjoyed The Three-Body Problem as it has some elements that I enjoy in sci-fi, like some harder sci-fi, as well as some big ideas. It reminded me a little bit of one of my favorite writers, Arthur C. Clarke, though it has some modern influences as well as Chinese influences. I know that the writing is a bit dry and that the characters are pretty flat, but that isn't the focus of the story, and I think what it does choose to focus on, it does pretty well. However, The Dark Forest tops it. I think it takes all of that, makes it bigger and better, even more mind-melty, as well as adding some more interesting plot elements. There are so many cool story ideas. I think that The Dark Forest probably could have been split into 4 or 5 books, and there's enough content there, but Cixin Liu just kept on turning out the ideas, ramping up the speed of the plot development, and The Dark Forest is one of my all-time favorite sci-fi books. So I'm a fan of the series, I'm a fan of all 3, but The Dark Forest is my favorite. So that makes the score 4-4. Up next, we have Deathstalker by Simon R. Green with Deathstalker versus Deathstalker Rebellion. That's a lot of Deathstalkers. Alright, Deathstalker, I'm a fan. I have been promoting this on my channel for a little while because I think the first book, it's kind of underrated, a little bit underhyped, it's gone a bit under the radar, but if you like pulpy sci-fi, space opera that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, that's just going to take you on a swashbuckling adventure. It's not going to take itself too seriously, but it does have some cool ideas, some cool action, a little bit of gore, a little bit of an edge to it, but also having a sense of humor, then I think Deathstalker might hit for you. I was really high on this one, although I felt like it fell a little bit flat right at the very end, but overall I really enjoyed my time with Deathstalker. Unfortunately, when it came to Deathstalker Rebellion, I think it focused on what for me was not the strengths of the series, not what I enjoyed most about book one. What I really enjoyed in the first book was the characters. I thought they had so much personality, the dialogue was flamboyant, and it focused on a smaller group of characters. Whereas in Deathstalker Rebellion, it tries to make the world bigger, the battle bigger, the stakes bigger, but for me, it felt like width was coming at the expense of depth. I didn't enjoy the new characters quite as much, and some of my favorite characters from book one were barely in the sequel at all, even though I thought they were quite important to the story. I think that the first book did have a pulpy quality to it, but I found it to be endearing, whereas the second book started to lose me a little bit, and in ways it started to feel a bit more like a first draft than a fully finalized novel. Overall, Deathstalker was the clear winner for me, so that puts Team Original up with a score of 5-4. Up next, we have Dune by Frank Herbert with Dune versus Dune Messiah. Similar to Foundation, Dune is one of the most important series in science fiction history, although the fantasy people are kind of trying to steal Dune from us, so we as a sci-fi community, we have to fight back. We need to hold on to Dune. Anyway, I really enjoyed the first book, Dune. The world building is incredible, the themes are incredibly rich and rewarding, and it's just such a deep book that I've only read once, but I'm sure pays off with layer after layer on a reread. For me, the only slight shortcoming in Dune was that at times it could be a little bit dry. That's an Arrakis joke, and the characters were a little bit hit and miss for me. Reading the first book, I was actually more interested in Jessica. I wanted more from Jessica, and I struggled a little bit to connect with Paul. But overall, I see why Dune is a lot of people's number one. I'm pretty high on Dune, maybe not as high as them, but still pretty darn high on Dune. When it came to Dune Messiah, I think it shared some of the same strengths. I really enjoyed the way that it expanded on the world, and again, I think the themes were its strength. It seemed a little bit more focused this time. Obviously, it's a shorter book, and I connected a little bit more with the character of Paul, which I enjoyed. However, I did have some rather noticeable plot complaints. For me, I think the most satisfying stories will build. There'll be peaks and valleys, and it'll reach satisfying climaxes. Whereas the way that Dune Messiah kind of plodded along felt a little bit like A to B to C to D, and we didn't really hit these emotional highs. Even though there were some pretty cool moments and some rather big things happened, everything sort of seemed to occur at a rather flat emotional level. So even though I enjoyed it, I think it was very well done, I didn't quite connect to it on the personal level that I was hoping I would. But I still really enjoyed Dune Messiah. I actually just finished it recently and will be continuing with the Dune books. So I have to give my point to, though, Team Original, I'm giving it to Dune, putting the score now at 6-4. So after 10 series, Team Original has a slight lead. We have 5 series to go. So let's see if Team Sequel can make a comeback. I'm just going to take a quick break. I'm a little jet lagged. I just got back from holiday. I haven't really talked much about that because I feel like you guys are here for the sci-fi, not for my adventures to Italy. But if you guys are interested in that for some reason, I'll throw a couple pictures up at the end. And while I'm just catching my breath here, if you want to talk to me more about sci-fi books or maybe pasta, feel free to join our Discord server. I'll leave the link in the description for that in the description. My brain's working pretty good, guys. We're going to get through this. Moving right along, we have Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds with Revelation Space versus Redemption Arc. I'm a big fan of Alistair Reynolds. I've read 7 of his books so far, and I really enjoy his big, grand, epic space operas with some harder sci-fi elements, some really ambitious ideas, and you do get that in Revelation Space, but this is also his debut novel, and it does feel a little bit like a first book. I feel like the writing is a little bit stiff at times, the characters aren't quite as interesting, but the potential is there, the ideas are there, and I still enjoyed this book, especially the second half. By the end of it, my mind was kind of blown and I knew I had to continue with the Revelation Space series. Which occurs with Redemption Arc, which I think is one of the all-time great space operas. Everything is bigger, everything is more epic, there's even more ideas, I started to connect with the characters, there's some great plot beats. It really just hits everything that I would want in a space opera, and yet also manages to do it in a surprising way. It's one of my favorite books. I'm super duper high on Redemption Arc. It would be my favorite Alistair Reynolds book if House of Suns wasn't even more amazing. But I love Redemption Arc. So that brings the score back to 6-5, still in favor of Team Original. And now for another one of my favorites, Sun Eater by Christopher Rocchio with Empire of Silence versus Howling Dark. Now I know not everyone is as high on Empire of Silence as I am. Some people think it's a little bit slow, a little bit too derivative, but for me, I was pretty immediately immersed in this world. I really like the characters, I love Rocchio's writing style, and this just gives you a good feeling of being in a sci-fantasy space opera world that just gets more intriguing, that the stakes continue to rise as you go throughout the series, and I feel like Book 1, Empire of Silence, does a good job of setting the stage for that. Howling Dark takes some of the things I liked about Empire of Silence and starts to add a little bit of weirdness. It has a bit of a gothic feel to it, and there are some genuinely jaw-dropping moments. If you get to the end of Howling Dark and you're not all in on the series, then maybe just Sun Eater isn't for you, but for me, I couldn't put this down. I read the last 200 pages, I think in one sitting, because I just needed to know what happened. I couldn't believe what I was reading on the page, and I think there were some slower moments in Howling Dark. There were a couple of things that I liked about Empire of Silence more, but I do agree with the majority of opinion that Howling Dark is a step up, and I'm going to give the slight edge to this one for Howling Dark. So that ties back up the score at 6-6. And now we move on to Teixcalaan by Arkady Martin with A Memory Called Empire versus A Desolation Called Peace. Firstly, two great titles. I think if we were ranking these books by title, these two would be near the top of the list. But that's not what we're doing today. What we are doing is comparing Book 1 versus Book 2, and Book 1, it's a little bit tough to get into. It's another space opera, but one that's a little bit more character and theme focused. But the reason why I say it's a little tricky to get into is because there's a lot of terminology and the naming convention is a little bit unorthodox. It might take some time for you to exactly remember who is who, but once I was able to do that, I really enjoyed the central mystery as well as the character and relationship dynamics. It was kind of fun trying to figure out who exactly could be trusted, who is friend or foe, or maybe something even more than friendly for some of the characters. This is not one of my all-time favorite books, but it's one that I'm pretty high on and I definitely enjoyed. A Desolation Called Peace takes some of those elements that I liked about A Memory Called Empire, but it was a little bit easier to read because I had already gotten into the series. And I think it did some things better and some things worse. I think it relied on some sci-fi tropes that I'm starting to get a little overly familiar with. It didn't seem quite as fresh an experience, but I think some of the things that it touched on were quite personal and I connected with and I enjoyed. I think overall I slightly enjoyed the story more in A Memory Called Empire, so I'm going to lean that way and give the point to Team Original, putting them back up 7-6. Alright, and for our penultimate series, we have the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons, with Hyperion versus The Fall of Hyperion. Hyperion is one of the most ambitious books in all of science fiction. It uses the Canterbury Tales structure in order to tell the stories of these different pilgrims traveling to Hyperion to visit the time tombs that are traveling backwards in time and are guarded by the mysterious Shrike. And what makes the book so interesting is that each of these tales are told in a different subgenre of science fiction. We have cyberpunk, we have military sci-fi, we have things that are a little bit more philosophical and religious, we have some things with a little bit more of a horror bent to them as well. So it really just ticks a lot of boxes. Although for me, I do have to be honest about Hyperion, I wanted a little bit more plot progression in the present timeline. Some people think that Hyperion could just stand alone, and they think it's the perfect book. For me, it almost feels like backstory to the actual story that I was most interested in. Now, when it comes to the sequels in Hyperion, they are not as equally beloved. The Hyperion fanbase is a little bit split on the sequels, and I have to say that I come down on the side of loving them. I adored The Fall of Hyperion. I know that it's a little bit slow at the beginning, I know it makes some weird choices towards the end, but I think this is peak space opera. I think the ideas are outrageous, the character moments are so impactful, there's so many memorable scenes in this book. I've said this before, but there was a point in this book where I physically had to stop reading and just think to myself, this is why I read. This is how much I am enjoying this book. I know it has some quirks, I know it has some flaws, I don't care. It's a 10 out of 10. It's everything that I want in science fiction. It's one of my all-time favorite books. It gets the point. I'm sorry, Hyperion's great too, but The Fall of Hyperion gets the point. Tying us up with one series to go at 7-7. And for our final series, the tiebreaker, we have the Jean Le Flambeur trilogy by Hannu Rajaniemi with The Quantum Thief versus The Fractal Prince. So this is a polarizing series. I said in my review for this series that I think 50% of you will love it and 50% of you will hate it. And that is because it is hard sci-fi and it just throws you into a far future, post-singularity, high-tech universe, and it just doesn't hold your hand. It can take quite a while to pick up the terminology, figure out exactly what on earth you are reading. But for me, what I describe as the anchor in that storm was two rather simple sci-fi tropes. You have a detective and you have a thief. The thief is trying to pull off a heist and the detective is trying to stop them. And so with that fun story, I was able to enjoy that and just let all the other more complex pieces, the sci-fi concepts, slowly absorb them through osmosis, start to put the puzzle pieces together, and in the end, I absolutely loved this book. It's one of my favorite things that I've ever read. It's incredibly unique. Half of you will hate it, but I think the potential rewards of reading this book is so high that if you can even tolerate just a small amount of hard sci-fi, you can just dive in there with just a little bit of trust. I think it's worth giving it a go. So how does Hannu Rajaniemi follow that up with The Fractal Prince? Well, I like some things that it does with The Fractal Prince. We get some new settings, it's quite thematically rich, but it's even more complex and it's a little bit slower, and for me, the plot wasn't quite as exciting, so it wasn't quite balancing that confusion with the fun. It was kind of balancing confusion with things that were intellectually stimulating, but you know, well, I think I need to put my hands the other way. But the scales were out of whack, is what I'm trying to say. I still really liked it. I think it was a solid book, but books 1 and 3 are my favorite in the series, with The Quantum Thief being my favorite. So there you go. Our final score after 15 series is going to be Team Original 8, Team Sequel 7. So there you go, guys. Team Original came out with the win, but at the end of the day, it was very neck and neck, and I think it could have gone either way. I think for me, there isn't something inherent about a book 1 or book 2 that makes one better than the other. Sometimes in book 1, an author uses up all of their good ideas. You kind of explore most of what there is to explore within a particular world or within a particular idea or those particular characters. Whereas sometimes in book 2, you work through a little bit of the problems in book 1, some pacing issues to kind of bring us up to speed in this world. Now we can focus on the good stuff, the fun stuff, and book 2 is able to flourish. So I think it can go either way. Let me know whether that's been your experience. Do you tend to prefer book 1s or book 2s, or is it a little bit of a mix like me? It just depends on the particular execution by the particular author in any particular book. That brings us to the end of the video. I want to go sleep, but it's daytime, and I don't think I should, so I'm going to stick it out. In the meantime, if you guys enjoyed the video, which I hope you did, hit that subscribe button. If you really enjoyed it, consider becoming a Patreon member. A Patreon member. Patreon member. Check out the perks of becoming a Patreon member. I'll leave the link to that in the description below, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and New Eden, Zakawe, Half Ogre, and the above average Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.